I love playing Mina Mazzini here on CIUT or anywhere, actually. Love listening to her voice. But we're going to be talking about another diva, the diva, as far as I'm concerned, of the screen, and that is Italian actress Anna Magnani. And James is on the phone, and we're going to have a delicious conversation, aren't we, James?
We sure are.
Well, I've been waiting for this retrospective forever, as you know.
I know you've been telling me for years, and here it
Yes,
is.
yes,
Do you know it
yay!
actually takes us back to the very first season of the Cinematheque 27 years ago? Because in our very first season, when we were at a commercial cinema up in Yorkville, we did an Anna Magnani retrospective. So this is the second one.
Well, I wasn't in the city for that, so
You probably weren't even born yet,
oh,
Donna.
oh, James. But let's introduce the audience to Anna because there might be some people who are not familiar with her name.
Yeah, she emerged in the 30s, actually. She was discovered on stage by Alessandrini, a very important Italian film director. He was one of the first to use sound, actually, in the Italian cinema. And he cast her in a film called The Blind Woman of Sorrento. They married, and I know this is so hard to believe, but she actually kind of withdrew from her career, her stage career, and her film career to be a dutiful wife to him. Unimaginable, right? And of course,
Yes.
and of course, that did not work out, and they separated in 1942. She was rediscovered by the great Italian film director Vittorio De Sica in a film called Teresa Venerdi, which is also known as Dr. Beware. It's a comedy in which he plays the central character, and she has only rather a bit role as his very volatile girlfriend, who is known as La Regina de Jazz, the Queen of Jazz, the Empress of Jazz. But he called this her first true film, and it sort of set a pattern with her that she would take these bit roles in another film that's in the series. She plays the maid. And again, she's not on screen for very long, but she steals all of these films, as she does in Teresa Venerdi. So that established her. Now, she came to international recognition in the film Rome, Open City, directed by Roberto Rossellini, whom she subsequently fell in love with. She plays Pina, and this partly established her persona because she's sort of an everyday working housewife, and in this case, because it's in the final days of the Nazi occupation of Rome, she's trying to save her man from the Nazis. And it was a film that became a huge international success and made her international reputation. But the thing is that there are a lot of myths about that film, but one of them is that it made her famous. She was famous before this. She was famous as a chanteuse. She was often compared to Edith Piaf. She was famous as a cabaret performer, as a stage actor, but also as a film actor. She had several roles, and some of them very important, prior to Rome Open City. And the one that I'm thinking of in particular is known in English as The Peddler and the Lady. I think it's important to know that the Italian title of the film is Campo di Fiori, which is the name of a famous market in Rome. If only because if you think of Rome Open City and then the fact that her very final role was in Fellini's Roma, you get the picture that she's the embodiment of Rome. You think of other famous actresses of Italian cinema. I mean, Monica Vitti, for instance. They, in no similar way, embodied a place the way that she did. And, she was known as La Lupa, the
Yeah.
she-wolf.
It's like
And it was because...
James, when I heard that title, I thought, perfect. It's like,
Well, it is
perfect.
perfect in many ways, partly because, of course, it gets at her voraciousness, her almost fearsome voraciousness as an actress, but also it is a sly reference to the myth of Romulus and Remus and the founding of Rome, the Eternal City. And again, it points out that Magnani is the embodiment of that city.
The twins, nursed by a wolf.
Exactly.
Yeah. She was very good at working with the best directors. You look at her cinema history and then the names that pop up. You mentioned Rossellini and De Sica.
And it goes on and on. You
Yes.
think of almost all the great auteurs, Lattuada, Pasolini, Visconti, et cetera, et cetera. And this places her in direct opposition to one of her best friends, Betty Davis, who she became very fast friends with, and they became mutual admirers. I think Betty Davis, at one point after she saw Bellissima, said she's the greatest actress she's ever known. But when you think of Betty Davis, who we did a series on a couple of years ago, she purposely, aside from William Wyler, chose a lot of B and C-list directors, and it was simply because she wanted to be the auteur of her films, her own films. She wanted to control everything, including makeup, costume, everything. Magnani gave herself to her directors and worked with all of the best directors. Even when she went into American cinema in the 60s, she worked with the 50s and 60s, I should say. She worked with great auteurs like George Cukor and Sidney Lumet.
Yeah, Cukor on Wild is the Wind.
And, when you think, I mean, of course, Cukor, the cliche there is, and it's true, that he was the greatest Hollywood director of actresses, and so it's natural that she would end up in his world. Now, the film that they made together, Wild is the Wind, is one of my absolute favorites. It's just one of the most devastating films. Emotionally, she's paired with Anthony Quinn, and you think, talk about a divo. So it's a divo and diva, and the situation is essentially he's lost his wife, she's died, and so he imports her sister from Italy to marry, and the sister is Anna Magnani. And it's almost bizarrely like Vertigo, in the Hitchcock's Vertigo, in that it plays on a man's desire to shape a woman as the ideal and her resistance to it, because Magnani is just totally heartbreaking in this film as this woman who can barely speak English, and she's being forced by her American husband to essentially become her dead sister, and it's an absolutely fantastic film. And of course, the two of them. Sorry to interrupt, Donna, but I just quickly wanted to say that the two of them were paired again towards the end of Magnani's career in The Secret of Santa Vittorio. And by then, Magnani knew that she loathed Anthony Quinn. And this film has one of the great marital battle sequences. It's a classic. And it's a classic partly because she stored up all of her resentment and let fly with it in the sequence. And she ended up, in fact, when she kicks him quite literally out of the house, she actually broke a bone in her right foot. Because she kicked him so hard. And she bit him on the neck in the sequence, and he later turned on her and said, "That's not even in the script." So, anyway.
And you mentioned Sidney Lumet, and Anna had a great relationship with Tennessee Williams, and I have to bring in The Fugitive Kind because I want you to tell the story about her and Marlon Brando, who she stars with in this sort of Southern Gothic. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to describe,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, the thing with Tennessee Williams, they became fast and true friends in the late 40s, early 50s, and he actually wrote the Rose Tattoo specifically for her, the role of Serafina. And she couldn't perform it on stage because her English wasn't strong enough, but she overcame her qualms enough to make the film version of it, for which she, of course, won the Academy Award for Best Actress. And there's a story that a journalist who she didn't attend the Academy Awards, never expecting to win, and a journalist after her name was announced, called her at her home in Rome, and she just could not be convinced. She thought this was a cruel joke that he was telling her. Anyway, The Fugitive Kind. This was not written specifically for her by Tennessee Williams, but was based on a play he'd written called Orpheus Descending. And Marlon Brando plays an ex-con in the snakeskin jacket who's kicked out of town, and he ends up traveling to this sort of backwater Louisiana town. This is where you, as you quite rightly said, Southern Gothic. And as in, let's say, a film like Pasolini's Roma, his presence sends all of these people into paroxysms of sexual desire. A lot of women. Joanne Woodward appears as a alcoholic who's desperate to get him into bed, and Magnani plays another one of her martyred wives. This is, one of her key roles. And in this case, she's married to this vicious store owner and of course, is suffering under him. So she sees Brando as a possibility of escape. Now, Brando really couldn't stand Anna Magnani for a couple of reasons. He thought this film was, he was a superstar by that time. It's 1960. He thought this film was his role, and he quickly became aware that it was Anna's fiesta, shall we say, and he resented her greatly. But what he really resented was her bold sexual advances. She was determined to get him into bed, and she was always suggesting that they rehearse their scenes alone. And it wasn't, she cherry-picked the scenes, and they were always the amorous scenes. And the story is that he attempted to control her by pinching her nose. Anytime that she came on to him, he just turned around and grabbed her by the nose. So that, again, was another very fraught actor-actress thing, the way that she had these disputes with Anthony Quinn on the other two films.
I find her. I find the film fascinating because knowing the backstory and the acting styles are so different. It's like Marlon is in his own method film,
yep,
and Anna is in her, sort of a downtrodden wife, but still, still larger than life. Anna.
No, absolutely. You've hit it exactly, and that's part of the fascination of the film. And Joanne Woodward too is yet another acting style, sort of histrionic and naturalistic at the same time. And it's a terrible thing to try to convince people to see a film for those kinds of reasons. But I quoted in the capsule in describing the film in our guide. I said something to the effect that can you resist a film that one critic at the time decried as a disgrace to U.S. culture? So,
well, there is one sweet line that's uttered by Anna Magnani's nurse, and I'm going to tease the audience because I want them to go and see this film because it's such a fascinating train wreck, and I love it. But James, I want you to just, in a few words, just describe what a melodrama is, because we've been talking about it as if everybody knows.
Well, I think I've mentioned to you before, Donna, and we have agreed in over the years that melodrama is one of our favorite genres. And I think I mentioned to you that it's a word that I actually avoid in describing films in capsules, because people immediately think that it means that the film is overwrought and mawkish and de trop. And yeah, actually melodramas can be, and that doesn't mean it's just that I just see them as emotional, highly emotional, highly emotionally wrought dramas, essentially. You can go back to the idea of melos, the origin of the term in Greek drama, etc. But Magnani was, and I think you're leading in that direction, was ideal for melodrama because, as you say, she was bigger than life. Her emotions were incredibly raw, and she could switch from one emotion to its exact opposite in a split second. She could go from sobbing hysterically to that raucous laughter of hers. When you think of a superstar like her now, you'd think it would be almost impossible because she had very coarse features. She had, those huge dark bags under her eyes and that voracious mouth of hers that, she very toothy mouth that she showed off when she laughed. She was famous for her laugh, of course, throwing her head back. And so she's ideal for melodrama. So a number of the films in the series certainly fall under that genre.
And what are some of the elements for people to look for in melodramas?
I would just say occasionally the improbability, but the emphasis is always on emotion. They're often tearjerkers, frankly, and I think of many of the films in this series that really fit that bill. I mean, I've already mentioned Wild is the Wind, which I would suggest you bring not just a little packet, but maybe a whole box of tissues too. Bellissima always rips your heart out. I mean, this is a film in which she plays a classic stage mother, a working class, a proletarian woman in Rome, who decides that her little girl is going to win the contest at Cinecittà for the prettiest girl in Rome. And there is immediately this disparity because the audience is aware that this is a very plain, talentless little girl, her daughter. But she expends all of her money, all of her time, all of her energy, Magnani, that is, as her mother, on trying to educate her daughter, giving her lessons, et cetera, so she can win this contest. And one of the most wrenching scenes in all of her films falls near the end of it, and it's a nighttime sequence. I won't give it away. On a bench, and where she just cries out her agony. And it turns out, I only found this out recently, even though I've seen the film maybe a dozen times, that was improvised by her. That wasn't in the script.
Wow.
The emotional reaction is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is ideal for melodrama.
Yeah. And I'm sure, she has, some tragedy in her life with her son. Right?
Absolutely.
So...
She had, her son was stricken with polio, and at, I believe, the age of 18 months, very early on. And again, she spent all of her time and her money on treatments for him. And in fact, when she fell in love with Roberto Rossellini after they made Rome Open City together, one of the things she said that drew her to him was the fact that he had lost a child, he had lost a son, and there was sort of this shared sense of misfortune.
Now, the retrospective is called Volcano, the Films of Anna Magnani. Let's talk about the film Volcano itself, which is featured.
Okay. I mean, one very strange thing that I would just note is that there are a lot of the words that apply to her. Volcanic is certainly one of them, but, you run into time and again vivacious, voracious, volatile, vital, trying to capture the kind of animal vitality of Anna Magnani. Volcano is a very little-known film, but there's a great backstory there in that she had been having this affair, this torrid affair with Roberto Rossellini, the great director, and in fact he had made a pair of films directly for her that he said was an homage to the art of Anna Magnani under the title L'amore, Love, a two-part film. And she was deeply in love with him. It was a very tempestuous relationship. She had once said that no man could ever dominate her. Well, Rossellini tried, and they were constantly having fights and throwing crockery at each other, et cetera, et cetera. But he then fell in love with the Swedish-American actress Ingrid Bergman, who had seen Rome Open City in Hollywood, wrote him a letter to say, I would love to work with you. She came to Italy, and the film that Rossellini had written specifically for Magnani's next performance, and he promised her it was going to give her her greatest role ever, Stromboli, which is set on a volcanic southern island. And it's about a refugee woman who ends up marrying a impoverished fisherman and moving to his tiny, very puritanical, very intolerant village and suffering mightily and trying to escape from the village. Anyway, he gave the role to Ingrid Bergman. And you can imagine how angry and upset Magnani was. She lost her man, and she lost this great film all in one go. And to somebody that I don't know if she considered her a rival, but she certainly became an instant rival from this. So the revenge that Magnani attempted to take was to make a rival version. She signed up for a film called Volcano, which was set and shot on a adjacent island. I mean, some say that you could just shout across the gulf of water between. I don't think that they were really that close. I think that was myth. But and the story is somewhat similar in that she plays a woman who is exiled back to her home village on the island. She tries to save her sister from this louche deep-sea diver. But, she apparently ended every evening after the shoot, she would go out and sort of glare across the water at the other island and try to put a hex on the shooting of Stromboli. Now, as things would have it, and this was the Volcano, by the way, was directed by an American director, William Dieterle, who said of Magnani that he had not seen acting like this since the silent period. He said she was the last of the shameless emotionalists, which I think is a very acute observation. Anyway, Stromboli, partly because of the scandal of the Rossellini-Bergman relationship, because they were not married and she got pregnant from him, and Stromboli became the famous film, and has gone into film history as one of the great films, whereas Volcano sort of immediately receded and has only been recently restored. It's actually a pretty good film. I mean, it's not Stromboli, which is a total masterpiece, but it stands up.
And another, I like so many of her films, but Mama Roma has a special place in my heart, just because of it seems to sum her up so much.
Oh, totally. And it shows, again, how incredibly adventurous and brave she was as an actress. Now, we shouldn't spend a huge amount of time on it because it actually played on the weekend. It's over, but people can see it on DVD, and it is one of the great films, I have to say. She plays a streetwalker, Roman streetwalker yet again, who is trying to go straight. She has a adolescent teenage son who she's trying to keep out of trouble, and everything falls apart. I mean, it is Pasolini's tragic world, and despite all of her attempts to make it straight as a vendor, a fruit vendor, and to keep her son out of trouble, everything ends up tragically, of course. And again, the ending, we go back to melodrama. The ending of the film, I have to tell you, is one of the most painful and devastating in all of cinema.
Yeah, and I mean, it's past, but I wanted to mention it because I wanted people, even though they missed it during this retrospective, to look for it afterwards.
They should search it out for sure.
It's such a good example of her talent in terms of humor and also her ability as a dramatic actress as well.
Well, you think of the opening sequence, and she's serenading a man who was her pimp as he's getting married, and the sequence is just, if you wanted to do a clip reel of Magnani's greatest moments, there, that would be a must, because she's so bawdy. And the film was kept out of America for a very long time because it was considered so kind of scurrilous.
Well, you mentioned the silent period, and she would have been perfect for that period as well. But nobody would be cast. She wouldn't be cast today.
No, I think that's a very sad fact. I mean, she had her career at the right moment.
Exactly.
I mean, in the end, and she was so funny and so honest about everything, because she made some comment, and I'm going to get it wrong, about, please don't try to cover up my wrinkles because I work so hard to get them. It just shows her nature, but she became considerably disillusioned with cinema towards the end of her career, partly because there were fewer and fewer roles for her as she aged. She ended up doing a whole series of television movies, a couple of which are featured in the retrospective, but she felt that Italian cinema had become over-intellectualized, that it had lost its bearings. And I think, although she wasn't explicit about it, I think she probably had in mind, obviously, Antonioni.
Yeah, well, that's who sprang to mind for me too.
And Bertolucci afterwards, etc. That whole new generation of filmmakers. Well, Antonioni wasn't a new generation. His career had started decades before. But I'm thinking of Antonioni going into the 60s with the directors who were influenced by Godard, etc., etc. Although Pasolini certainly falls into that cadre.
Yeah. But the film in general was changing in the 60s, and she couldn't move forward, I don't think.
No, I think that her kind of raw naturalism was no longer in fashion, frankly. And that kind of oversized, bigger-than-life performance, there were no directors who were looking for that anymore. I mean, think of the Francesco Rosi or Bertolucci or any of those directors who emerged in that period. They were looking for a much more restrained style than Magnani was capable of.
Well, James, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for bringing this retrospective to TIFF Cinematheque. And I'll be seeing you at some of the screenings.
I'm sure I'll see you often.
Okay, then.
Okay, Donna. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And that was James Quandt, Senior Programmer at TIFF Cinematheque. You're listening to the More the Merrier, and up next I'll be broadcasting an interview that I actually have posted on YouTube, but it features director Pete Travers and his film City of Tiny Lights, which screened at TIFF 2016. And I brought it back out just because the star of that film, Riz Ahmed, is in Rogue One. And Pete does reference the film, and I just did not get it at the time that Rogue One was the one that he was talking about. So stay tuned for a very quick station identification, and then I'll be back with that interview. You're listening to CIUT 89.5 FM.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5, the sound of your city. CIUT 89.5 FM, the station that brings you a sonic journey on Across the Universe with Ken Stour. Sunday evenings, 5 to 8 p.m. CIUT 89.5 FM, the sound of your city.
Pete, welcome back to Toronto.
Thank you. It's a fun place to be for me.
Now, you were here, you won the 2004 Discovery Award at TIFF. What's the experience been like since then?
That was a big moment for me, my film winning that award. It kind of catapulted me up into places where I got to make choices that I wouldn't have been made to otherwise. So this festival's always had a special place in my heart, really, because that recognition of Roma was a big thing, and that led to Vantage Point. And it's nice to be invited back now with another similarly very personal film. It's a special place to come.
How did you get attached to the project?
Soon after Ohm had finished, around about 2006, Ado, the producer, gave me the book of City of Tiny Lights written by Patrick. And I loved the idea of it. There seemed something compelling about a private detective whose job was to dig up other people's secrets or bury them, and he couldn't see that the biggest secret in the world was the one of his own. That seemed like a really cool idea. And set against the backdrop of London, which for me had never really been kind of portrayed as well as it could have been since the likes of films like My Beautiful Laundrette and Mona Lisa, which were the sort of touchstones for me, because I remember when I watched those films in the early 80s, it felt like a renaissance or a rebirth of British cinema, where you could do real subjects but do them in a kind of beautiful, poetic way. So I kind of thought I could do that with this. And there was something about the title. I just had this image in my head of I think I saw a postcard of a sort of picture of a city with lots of lights out of focus. And it seemed somehow that all of those lights were somebody's life. And the City of Tiny Lights seemed to just somehow capture the magic and of what living in a big city could be like.
Did being a social worker in the past influence how you shot the film?
Having done social work in the past doesn't influence the way I shoot the film, I guess, except in the sense that I'm sort of infused with a desire to be real, and I have a sort of, I hate things that feel fake, so I'm always looking for realism, I guess, but realism in a way that can be beautiful. I sort of, in the way that Magnum photographers photograph the real world, but they don't just, it's not just, they have a point of view, and they look for sort of hope and beauty in the world, and I guess I've always tried to do that. So this film, I knew it had to be beautiful. I wanted it to be beautiful, because I think living in a big city is very sexy and exciting. And I've never really been one that sort of feels that to be real means you have to be grim and miserable, because I don't feel grim and miserable.
I asked the question because some of the ways in which you shoot the street scenes with the kids and the back and forth, the youth center, are very realistic to me and very casual in terms of how the actors are behaving.
Yeah, well, the kids are all real kids, most of them who haven't acted before. We spent a long time. I had a wonderful casting assistant who spent 3 or 4 months trying to find those kids. So they all come from real places, and they all understand what they were doing, and so they weren't really having to act much. And I think that's the secret, I guess. So I suppose, in a sense, it's not so much. I mean, I used to work as a community worker in a community centre in King's Cross before I was a filmmaker, and having had that experience, I guess, helps you understand how real things are, so you don't feel like you're doing a movie version of it. But it's really important to me that those things feel improvised, although they're not, but they look like they are. And it's that feeling that makes people feel like they're really there. But I think also a handheld camera is like another character in the story. It's always been important to me that the camera has a point of view, and that it feels like it's observing real life, but also a part of it, that it's not cold and sitting back, or it's not too fussy and making it look fake. So all those things, I guess, combined with a sort of desire to want to make it feel as real and as natural as possible.
Can you describe how you worked with your cinematographer, Felix Peterman?
City of Tiny Lights is the third film I've done with Felix. He's a genius. Young man who's in his late 20s, early 30s. I first saw his work for a film we did for television, which was achingly beautiful. A story about a young black man that was killed by his friends, and it was poetic and wonderful. And I loved his use of light. He's got elements of a sort of young Anthony Dodd Mantle in him, and I've worked with Anthony, and I know how extraordinary he is. Felix has got that same sense of ability to deal with light and use light evocatively. And we've done 3. This was the 3rd thing we've done, and we just have a rapport, I guess. And he understands the things I like, and I know what he's really good at. And when we look at stuff together, we tend to look at visual references that are inspiration rather than and try and make our locations feel like them, depending on what the need is. And also, I think the camera needs to tell you the subtext of the story. I mean, being real doesn't mean I just show you a picture of something. There's a very famous phrase about, well, if a picture doesn't tell a story, it's not worth taking. Felix gets that, and that's why I've loved working with him.
Definitely comes across, and you're so right. The City of Tiny Lights, that image, you definitely gave that in the film, because I got it immediately from the first shot, and then subsequent shots of the city, and how this is just one section of a huge, vast city that comes across.
Thank you. No, I think living in a big city is sexy and scary and can be very lonely, but I think there's something in it about making connections that, if you're open to it, the things that you thought were your family and your friends can change when you're in a big city. You can meet people you never imagined you would meet, have encounters you never would have imagined you might have, and your life can be open to a different path if you're open to it. And in a way, I suppose the film's a metaphor for that. Tommy's got a past that he's frightened of, and he's living in a sort of grotty hovel with his dad, who's a drunk. And it's like, will he be brave enough to sort of find the pieces of his past that can be hopeful and forge a new kind of future? And in a way, I think that's kind of a metaphor for a city, especially now where, property and money is taking over places and forcing ordinary people out of places where they used to live. I mean, part of the problem in London these days is there's loads of property development that's owned by people that don't even live in England, and it's a scary thing when those things happen. It's like, I think sometimes you have to ask the question, what is progress supposed to be? We're supposed to love shiny new buildings, and that's great, but the question is, who's actually going to live in them? What are they going to do? And who's the people that they displaced? Those kind of questions don't get asked enough, I don't think. And we're in our own little subtle way trying to go, why are we doing this again?
The same thing is happening here in Canada's large cities as well. For Toronto, the development is in a boom. My own neighborhood in the past 5 years has got at least 13 condos going up, and there's more planned, and they're sort of destroying the reason people wanted to live there in the first place.
I think it's important that we are brave enough to question this sort of material progress that's sort of sold to us as your city's becoming having its own bright new future. The question is whose bright new future is it?
Exactly.
It's not always the bright new future of the people that used to live there. It's a bright new future of people with money, and sometimes those people aren't even people with money that even live there. So I think there's lots of hard questions to be asked about that, because I think cities all over the world are finding themselves subject to sort of property booms, and everybody says it's amazing and how beautiful it all makes your city look. But I always go, well, beautiful for who, really?
Exactly. So you mentioned the character of Tommy Akhtar, played by Riz Ahmed. You couldn't have found a more perfect actor.
It was always Riz. Even in the early stages of development, 4 or 5 years ago when I first met him, there was never anybody else who was going to play it. Even I saw even in his very early work, like Three Lions, a sort of tough vulnerability that he has. It's the kind of quality that the likes of Russell Crowe and Denzel Washington have, a sort of manly man that's not afraid to be emotional. And that's in pretty short supply, I'd say, everywhere in the world in terms of movies these days. And Riz has just got it. He's just got it. He's kind of effortlessly tough and cool looking, but he's not afraid of his heart and his emotions. And he's got the most beautiful, soulful eyes you can imagine. It's like men and women can stare at him all day and and just wonder what he's thinking. And that's an extraordinary quality for an actor, I think. And he's got the ability to control it and play with it and use it. And that's so rare. So there was never anybody else. We almost wrote it for him, I'd say. He made a commitment to our film 4 or 5 years ago, before he was the huge star he is now, and all credit to him, he stayed with that commitment even when I'm sure he had other pressures on his time than making our small little film that probably didn't pay him very much money, that he stayed true to that commitment because he loved the idea of what the film was about, and because in a way, this is a film about voices that don't normally get heard, and there aren't many. I can't think of another British film where there's a sort of young 35-year-old Asian leading man, where the film's not about his social problems. He's just a guy with a job.
Exactly.
He's just a guy with a job. That's the story.
Exactly. It's not about exactly being, from an ethnic background at all. It's part of him, but the story is about the private detective who's hired to find this friend of a prostitute, and where that leads him. Yeah,
he's got a very important line in the story. His dad's sort of, comes from Uganda and fled from there after from Idi Amin, and feels Britain has a certain beauty to him, but he still feels like an immigrant. His dad, Tommy's second generation. He's British. He doesn't accept the stuff his dad talks about anymore. From him, it's like he's just British. It doesn't matter where his dad came from. And I think it's important that you tell stories about people, regardless of their race and their colour or their sexuality, that are just stories about them, where they're not defined by the story's not defined by what they look like, because it feels a bit limiting to me that we do that diversity in casting should also include diversity of storytelling, where we tell stories about people whose lives we never see, where they're not stories about whether they're sort of terrorists or drug dealers or whatever they're supposed to be, but actually just people in love, people that have jobs, people that can't get on with their mum and dad, just like ordinary stories. And I think we've got a long way to go to change those things, but it's important that we do, I think.
Yeah, and both those elements come out. You've got the sense of community, but you've also got the noirish aspect of Tommy being a detective, drinking scotch, and you've got the femme fatale, and you've got the dark lady involved, and also the deeper element of who else is involved in this woman's disappearance.
Yeah, the noir is just the way to tell the human story. It's Vantage Point's an action movie. City of Tiny Lights is a sort of noir thriller, but it's got a human story at the heart of it. So you play with all the tropes of it because it's part of what people are excited about when they watch a sort of a crime thriller in a sort of Raymond Chandler-esque way. But at the same time, you hope, in the same way that Chandler's stories were very optimistic and romantic, that you can tell an optimistic romantic story and still keep all of those things, because they're fun to watch, and it's fun to sort of chase the rabbit and see who did what they're supposed to have done and whether they didn't do it or did do it. But at the same time, you need to have a clear grasp of the emotional landscape of your story. And for me, it was always important that not everybody's going to be a private detective, and not everybody's as effortlessly cool as Riz Ahmed. Sadly, we're not. But we were all 17 once, and had dreams about what being a kid was like and what we thought our futures would be. And then you all get to 35 and wonder what happened to those dreams, and whether you lost them along the way somewhere, and whether you lost the people they were attached to even, and what you can do about that now. And maybe the people that you thought were your friends won't always be your friends forever, but does that really matter? You make new friends tomorrow that could sustain you over the future. And I think it's, in a way, that's a universal story. So in a way, we wanted to use the sort of genre of noir, which I've always loved. When I was a kid, my mum and dad used to, on Saturday nights for us, was always going to my relative's house and sitting and watching my mum and dad fall asleep and watching old black and white movies of Humphrey Bogart, solving a crime. So I've always been influenced by that stuff, and thought it was exciting to try and use that genre to tell a sort of very human story about what living in a city was actually like.
You've got Roshan Seth in your film. Was he always on the list as well?
There was never anybody else other than Roshan. It's the same with Riz. After I'd met Riz and told him I wanted to do it, we pretty soon after that met Roshan and did the same. If you look at the history of films and look at where you think they came from, I was heavily influenced by, My Beautiful Laundrette and Mona Lisa, and Roshan was in My Beautiful Laundrette. Yes. So he's pretty much playing a sort of the same dad 30 years on, to a certain extent. And he, again, when I met him, totally loved the project and totally loved the idea of it, and stayed true to it over 3 or 4 years when other things could have come his way. But again, there was never anybody else going to play Farzad.
How has the reception been to the screening of of Tiny Lights?
Yesterday, the world premiere was awesome. Everybody laughed at the right bits and looked genuinely shocked when it was supposed to be shocking. And the kind of denouement went down really well. It was kind of satisfying to watch. I love the Ryerson Cinema. It's such a huge space, and there's like 1,200 people there watching it on a big screen, and it's just really, it's like you can hear a pin drop during it, and then sort of riotous laughter and applause when there's a big denouement, which worked really well. So it's a lovely place to watch a movie with people, and it seemed to play really well. It was really exciting.
You need to go to Ryerson Theatre when there's a Midnight Madness.
Yeah, I was here with Dread from Midnight Madness, and it was mad. I don't think City of Thunder Lights is quite a Midnight Madness movie, but no, in that one people were screaming out and shouting at the screen all the time. It was pretty cool.
I'm glad you've experienced it because it's definitely a different energy there.
Audience participation cinema, it's great.
Yes, it is. The film is beautiful. The movement is beautiful. Tell me about working with is it your cinematographer, your editor, to get those lovely sort of blurry, passing, moving shots?
The blurry stuff is kind of an example of a bit like stop-go animation, where you sort of change the speed and the camera shutter angle so that it kind of slows the rest of the thing down except the person that you're filming. So it's sort of it's like if someone's running, the camera can follow them and they're in focus, but everything else around them is out of focus. So we just found that technique. Wong Kar-wai used it a lot in his early films, and me and Felix really fell in love with it and thought we could find ways to do it to capture something of the beauty of the city, I guess. The energy when Tommy needed to be frantic, it works quite well when there's a sort of action sequence where some guy chases him down a lift with a gun, and it worked really well there because it got the frenzied madness of being chased by somebody with a gun. Because I've done lots of car chases and explosions before that have been very realistic, and I quite like the idea of being slightly more emotional with the camera, and I thought that allowed us to do that. So that's all done in camera. That stuff that's not a visual effect that's added afterwards. That's just the way the camera's sort of you can change the shutter angle and the speed to make it look like that.
You blend the past with the young Tommy and the older Tommy really well. Can you tell me about casting those young actors who's playing Tommy and his friends from his youth?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm most pleased with is the way the past turned out, because I always had doubts, to be honest, as whether we'd probably just end up cutting the past out altogether and be so bothered about the thriller in the present that we wouldn't have space for it. But the young actors that played young Shelley and young Tommy specifically, and young Lovely, they were captivating. The love affair between Tommy and Shelley, the way those two young actors played it was just achingly beautiful. Hannah had just gone to drama school, so this was her first. She'd barely done that much acting, but done enough just to get to drama school. So this was her first job, and she was just extraordinary. And then the young lad that played young Tommy, again, he had Riz's eyes, which was extraordinary again, and he had a sort of stillness to him, and he hadn't done any acting ever before. So all the kids were all cast by our sort of youth casting director, I guess. She went off and found loads of kids, and I must have seen hundreds of kids for the young Tommy and loads of girls for young Shelley, and those two were just standout. Hannah's gone to drama school now and is working. I'm not sure whether young Tommy's going to want to carry on doing acting. He just loved doing it that once. But again, it's really important. We searched all over to find those two kids. And if you're going to get that kind of quality, you need to spend a lot of time looking for it.
I'm glad you kept those elements, because the movie wouldn't have had the same feel if you had cut it. And normally I hate flashbacks because I think, it's a waste of my time. Show me somewhere, some other way. But in this sense, your flashbacks were absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's, when you look at it now, it's impossible to imagine the film without them, because without that innocence, you don't know what it is that Tommy's lost. Because and you don't know You don't know why he aches for that to come back. So when Shelley walks back into the present from her, 15 years later, if you don't see what they were like when they were 17, you don't really know the ache of what that was like. If you don't feel the first time they kissed when it was supposed to be sort of wrong, you don't know why they feel guilty. And the truth is, they didn't do anything wrong. They just fell in love with each other and didn't do, that's all they did. But they felt a terrible guilt about that because of the implication it had for one of their friends. So there was something really innocent about what they did that I think really captures the sort of breathlessness of being 17 and falling in love for the first time. I think it's sort of... I love watching that part of the film now because it's so tender and sweet, but not sort of sentimental, but actually they both look vulnerable. Because Shelley plays this... Hannah plays young Shelley as a girl that's kind of beautiful. Everybody wants to be with Shelley, but it's like none of the other men, and certainly her boyfriend, doesn't really see her. He just sees what she looks like. He doesn't see the shy girl beneath the gorgeous exterior who just wants someone to listen to her. And Tommy's the geeky teenager who... he's not the most attractive looking kid in the school, but he knows how to listen. And she finds that endearing. And it's just I just really like the fact that there's a sort of, there's a beautiful girl that feels misunderstood, and actually she falls in love with the geeky lad, who then turns out to be the beautiful man in the end, because you don't get many more men more beautiful than Riz. So it's sort of the ugly duckling turns into the swan story.
Pete, it was a pleasure meeting you and talking about this film. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
And that was my interview with director Pete Travis talking about his film City of Tiny Lights, which screened at TIFF 2016.